Thank you. Tiki Medal, would you like to lead us, please?
Mai te pai manga, rarakiti tai. Mai te awa tonga, rarakiti awa raki. Tēnei te hapori, awhi ai taratahi. Whanau, haramai te toki. Humiei, huiei, tai.
Have we got any apologies?
Mere on for
lateness, thank you. Any other apologies? I'm happy to move. Do I have a second? Oh.
I think Robin Cherry Campbell's normally here by now, so apologies.
Yeah,
She's not a member.
Robin's not on the
member.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, cool.
Yep. Okay. So I'm happy to move. Do I have a seconder? Grace, thank you, Councillor Grace. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Any conflicts of interest on decision on the annual report? None. Public forum? None. Our first and only report is 5.1, our draft annual report. Okay, so is Cara going to introduce it, or do you want to introduce it? You do it this time?
You can do it next time.
Yeah. Okay.
Kia ora, everybody. So this is the draft annual report for the financial year ended 30th of June 2023. Noted in the report that we are still working on a few final bits in the report. Those are generally highlighted yellow. One additional piece I did want to raise, we've completed some work around our impairment assessment related to roading. So you recall we had several damaging weather events in the last year. We're required under accounting standards to assess whether there's impairment on the road which would reduce the value. So Kyra has completed some work. We haven't put the adjustment through the accounts yet, as we would like audit to review it first and be comfortable with where we've got to. But once it's completed, we're expecting a significant adjustment in the accounts. So what that would do is we recognise the reduction in value. I can talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but would recognise the reduction in value of the assets through the statement of financial performance as an expense. So what that's potentially going to do is give us a deficit, a significant deficit, but I guess it's remembering it's not a cash transaction, it's just a decrease in the value of our assets, recognising the damage on our roads. Did you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, I might actually, as chair, I might actually drive the whiteboard and just give an example, right? Because impairment is actually quite, right? I had to get my head around it a long time ago. And unfortunately for my sins, I was in Kaikoura post-earthquake, not the 2017 audit, but the 2018 audit. And obviously impairment for them was a pretty major sum of money. And it's important to understand the principle of impairment and also why it's important in the financial statements. So I'm not going to use infrastructure. I'm going to say, who owns a car here? Right? Okay. No, depending on what sort of car it's worth, might be say just you know, so it's a newish car, and say in your books at the moment, you know, it's a new it costs 56,000. Okay. That's what my son's one, not my one cost that, right? At the moment, your carrying value after depreciation might be 40,000. And on the 29th of June, a truck decides to go up and it fails to, too closely and hits the back of it and does $10,000 worth of damage. Okay. So at 30th of June, if you are recognising that in your financial statements, what's the car worth?
30 grand.
30 grand. Yeah, simple. So that's the principle of impairment. So what happens is, as Kelly has said, you recognise that as an expense in your financial statements as a loss called impairment. Or I call it super depreciation. But what happens is because the car's worth 40 and you're well insured, on 2 weeks later, what happens?
Gets
Now back,
Gets
it
fixed.
gets fixed.
We're still waiting for bits.
Yeah, I'm still waiting. Mine happened 6 weeks ago and I'm still waiting for bits, Brian, absolutely, right? Exactly.
But like, yeah, eventually.
Eventually it is restored back.
Yeah.
So, but what happens, so the issue then becomes why you've actually recognised it as an expense is when you get the insurance money, it's recognised.
Yeah.
It offsets, otherwise
Yeah.
it offsets it out. That's the principle behind it. So you actually, when you spend this $10,000, then you're actually restoring the asset back and you're offsetting any income. That's the principle behind it.
And so the risk for this committee is, as Kelly said, is the amount of damage on the roads. When that's factored in and it shows a significant deficit,
Yeah.
it's who reads it and how they interpret what that looks like.
Yeah.
It's not a catastrophic failure of financial management or financial planning. It's a timing issue around impairment.
Yeah.
Just understanding what impairment
Yeah.
looks like.
And the issue is often when you've got infrastructure, you might do other work at the same time to improve it, right? Because, you're doing the work now, this other work needs to be done. So you're only recognising the cost to restore that asset back to its original condition and size before the event, right? So that's a really, and you might have actually had a car for a while, right? You might decide that you're going to repaint the whole thing. So the cost actually to repair might cost $12,000, right? Because you're going to spend a couple of grand doing some other work to your car at the same time, but you'd only be only recognising the cost to bring it back to its condition at the time of the accident. But it's normally impairment is an event. It's not a degradation over a period of time.
We don't actually get any insurance money, do we, for our roads?
No, but you get subsidy from
Well,
for some of them,
yeah,
right?
and then we can get basically full subsidies on storm damage.
Yes,
So that's like an insurance basically.
it is an insurance, yeah.
Yeah.
And also what's not factored in is the work that's done to prevent the next failure. In other words, to,
Medium.
over engineer.
Yep.
In hope or the expectation that the next event, the damage will be less. But it's for the purpose of this discussion, it's more about just signalling
Yep.
that when it comes in with a significant deficit, that's the reason behind it. That's the explanation. So we'll make sure, or Kelly and Kyra will make sure that in the document that there's an explanation beneath it so that it's as clear as it can be.
And in the subsequent year, when we get the subsidy and we put the road back the way it was.
You reverse the impairment,
Right.
so you're surplus. Right? Okay, so you look super good. This is this is the issue that you have. It's got to be disclosed really well. But I would say you're not alone. I'd hate to think what Auckland's impairment's going to be. Hastings impairment, they're not even worrying about it because it's so difficult. They're just going to say, we don't know because of the cost to it. Because they've lost a whole lot of bridges. So they're still working through at the moment what it's actually going to cost. And that's part of the problem is it's really easy when you've got a vehicle, it's quite easy to assess, but when you've got a whole lot of work to be done, it becomes quite a protracted discussion. And what is the cost to repair often takes some time. And that's the challenging bit when you're talking infrastructure. Particularly when you've got road slips. And are you actually, and then this is the argument, are you actually improving the asset as well? Because if you're improving the asset, that's not an impairment in terms of the calculation. And that's something that ought to have a really, really good look at. So that's going to be, you got any guesstimates of the numbers, ranges? No guesstimate?
Oh,
We can,
rather,
no.
it's a big number. It's
Big
but
number.
it really is the
And-
initial work we've
Yeah.
don't know, so.
Yeah, and it is going to be a big number.
Yeah, well, if you recall, we were spending, I think, around $8 million on,
Yep.
on roading.
Yep.
So,
It's in that ballpark, but it may not be 8 million
yeah.
because of, could be more, could be less. And that's,
Expecting this.
Does everybody understand?
Yeah. Yep.
The concept without the dollars attached to it?
well, that's why I thought I'd use a nice, a non-infrastructure example,
That's helpful.
because the issue is it's an event and it's something that, you're not responsible, you couldn't have been responsible for.
If that was a hold, and the figures would have gone the other way.
Still waiting. That's
Still waiting. So, yeah.
Be worth repairing.
Right,
Okay.
okay. So that's impairment.
And then probably the other thing I wanted to raise, mentioned in the report, is we're expecting a qualified audit opinion, specifically around the survey measures in the financial section. So we've discussed this a number of times, both at Risk and Assurance and at Council. So that's not a surprise. We're waiting for the actual audit report, so we see how it looks. But we
Yeah.
understand that will be in there. And then final thing I wanted to mention, we are still working towards the adoption date of 25th of October. Under statutory deadline, we have to have it adopted by 31st of October, but we're aiming for that council meeting on the 25th. It is a tight timeframe, which I think I've also mentioned several times, and probably the riskier areas I consider to be fixed assets, both working through the impairment and making sure audit are happy with that, and also the fair value assessment on our infrastructure assets. But we are still planning for that date, and we'll let council know if anything changes there. Those are probably the things I wanted to flag, but I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Any questions? Bit of a meaty document to read, isn't it?
Just probably just something that Kelly didn't mention, but we're also seeking clarification regarding wastewater treatment plant and final wash up of that as to whether any disclosure is required in this document, and if so, what it might look like, just so that we're transparent and full disclosure, but we're just unsure as to how that sits in this particular document.
It's not a contingent liability. It's not a contingent asset. You can't have contingent assets. So that's the issue is, of course, it's currently legally privileged as well. So in terms of the watch up, so there's a whole lot of issues that need to be carefully considered. But again, that's that message that needs to be given to the community that we're working through it at this stage.
And also, I've been through this with Mayor On, and there are a couple of minor changes to his introduction and a few little wording and typos, but nothing to do with the actual financial part and the reporting of Kelly and her team. I'll make a comment about the financial statement about that. Page 59 wasn't it?
I mean, to me, this is, I review one or two of these a year, and I'm actually really pleased that if you actually look at on page 52 of the agenda, the overall council funding impact statement, is that you would actually see that we've actually spent almost exactly compared with budget, our capital works total. And if you add those three figures together, both figures come in both the budget and the actuals comes pretty close to $9 million. Now, there's a lot of councils sitting around the countryside that are sitting around the 70% achieved. Now, in terms of totality.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, you've got
some carry forwards that sits outside the annual budget.
That's right. But totally. But this is what I have seen elsewhere, Kelly,
Yes,
right?
sure.
That they haven't spent their carry forwards plus the current budget. We've actually and you've carried some more figures. So, but their total, your total.
Yeah.
Is actually what you've agreed you're going to spend 9 million, you spent 9 million. I know there's some stuff carried forward and you've carried some more stuff forward.
Mhm.
But I've seen other councils carry forward the budget, right? And then still, when you actually add, their total budget, they're still way short.
Sure.
So that to me is, while there's a timing issue, I think that's, to me, it's really pleasing and that I've reviewed this a couple of times. I've read it a couple of times looking for issues, and other than the impairment and the note on SSPs, there were no issues that I would want to bring to the committee in terms of concern or to Kelly. So this is actually a good result for council. And, we are, you're meeting the statutory timeframe, both internally in terms of that, but also Audit New Zealand. And I can say that hand on heart, not every council will be doing that this year because of a variety of effects.
And just to labour the point on the customer satisfaction, as Kelly said, we've discussed it at council, but what we're saying is that we acknowledge there's a risk around qualified report from audit. We're not saying no to customer satisfaction surveys. We're pressing pause to find out if there's better ways to get the more useful information to help us guide us going forward. So we're not saying we're not interested in what the public say. We're trying to get the best value out of the cost of running customer satisfaction surveys.
Yep.
Questions, team? Big Doc.
Do we have examples of other councils and what they do instead of satisfaction surveys?
Yeah, we're looking at that at the moment, and we're also doing a bit of work with an external consultant who's completing work with other councils, particularly around those well-beings and how you might create a framework to report against the well-being. So that includes things like resident survey or what you might do instead. Targeted surveys around users, say at the library or the pools, those kinds of things. So we are looking at that kind of work now. I don't know if you want to add anything, Jerry.
As we're bringing that back to you for council workshop in a couple of weeks. So yeah, there are other councils that are doing different things, particularly, for example, Tairāwhiti after Gabrielle, I think they've been doing a lot of wellbeing surveys in terms of what can council do to support wellbeing. So really targeted around how people are feeling.
Yeah.
So that's, as Dale said, that what we feel is really important is actually things that are relevant to our community and hearing from the people that use and value those services and opportunities that we provide.
I just feel it's kind of deteriorated our surveys to measuring a level of dissatisfaction rather than a level of, so it's about trying to find not just the grizzles and react to them, but to find out what we can gather that's going to usefully inform our processes going forward so that we can deliver improvement rather than reacting to the negative or historical things that have happened in the past that we can't have any control over.
So I remember mentioning at the when we looked at the survey at the end of last year, how it didn't seem to really line up a lot with the metrics and the success rates, and then the grumbles were loud, and it didn't seem to really correlate to the outcome.
Yeah. And when some of those grumbles and the transportation were about the state highway as well. So to me, I think that you've got some challenges going forward because it's not only for this annual report, but next annual report, even if you do change the survey measures as part of the LTP, which is good, you'll still have the same issue you'll have to consider for the next annual report. And that's probably another discussion that we actually, I'm not looking at you, but right, but we actually, Jerry, we need to bring back to the, where are we, March-ish meeting,
February meeting.
February meeting, and look at options for how we do that survey, if we do the survey, because again, if we don't do it, again, there'll be a further qualification.
And I also sense it's not it's not a one size fits all anymore. We put all of our hope and expectation on one satisfaction survey. And it generally is targeted towards one type of demographic, one type of thought process or feedback process. And I just think nowadays there's a whole layer or raft of what gaining feedback that we've got to try and tap into.
Having ones that are more targeted to people who are actually visiting the library, if there's a drop-in box sort of thing, you'd be getting actual feedback on people who are using it.
Yeah.
It's a broad brush.
I actually wonder, and Chief Executive's not here, I wonder whether, I don't want to put burden staff at the moment, but sort of a bit of a journey in terms of their thinking, because I think the committee needs to make a recommendation to council no later than February about how to address the survey for the next annual report, because, you know, you got your LTP, but so the LTP, your way of thinking of doing the survey, the LTP will inform what we do for the annual report. But we need to look at saying, is there anything we can do between now and then?
I think if we have that workshop that Jerry's talking about and the full council have an opportunity to see the lie of the land.
Yep.
And then run it past risk and assurance.
Absolutely, yeah. All I'm signaling is I think you need to actually have that decision, what you do after the next annual report.
Yeah.
By February next year.
Yeah. Is there anything in the document, anybody who's here, committee members or not?
Those are good pages to look at. Deputy Mayor, do people understand those?
Page 89,
Yeah.
financial prudence benchmarks, rates affordability, lack of, whichever lens you've got, total debt.
We are required, so you can, so I'm stealing your thunder here.
No, you go.
We are, every council is required to have those benchmarks and every council is required to report on them. There are a couple of organisations that do pay particular credence to how you have actually achieved them on that.
I'm happy, if you'd like to just to touch on the two that we haven't achieved.
Yep.
I think it's probably worth noting. So those are the rates related ones. There's the rates, income, affordability, and rates increases affordability. So you see the 2023, we're orange, we're above our limits for both. So those were both expected. We had planned for that in the 2023 annual plan, just based on the budgets we needed at the time when setting the plan. We're going to exceed our limits. So one of the issues with the limits are they're quite low. So particularly the rates increases affordability. The limit we've imposed on ourselves on council is the Burl cost index plus 2%. So in the 2023 year, those who are here setting the plan will recall the limit that gave us, the Burl index was 2.8% plus 2%, 4.8, whereas inflation at the time was running much higher than that. So the decision was made by council in setting the annual plan that we would reach the limit and explained why. The second graph, the rates increases affordability, the actual amount we're exceeding the limit by is more than we'd planned. But that's because of when you set the plan, it's based on what you know of the rating units at the time. So we actually had more come on before we set the rates. So that increased the rates we collected as well as the penalties amount. So that's why we've exceeded by more than we had planned.
So they were conscious decisions of
They were
council,
conscious decisions of
of the council at the time. The other ratios that you've achieved are more operational and more how to describe it? Yeah, more retrospectively looking, right, of how well you've done, and you're all on the green in those. So
So is that explanation that you've just given there, is it useful in the areas like that that we have not achieved? Is it useful to put
Yeah,
a short explanation underneath each of those in particular?
I think you're right, and particularly flagging that is in line with what was planned, because the way the graphs show, you've got the limit
Yeah.
and you've got what you've achieved, but it actually doesn't, you're not disclosing
Yeah.
what you had planned in the
Yeah.
annual plan.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. We'd be
Yeah.
happy to add in some
Yeah.
disclosure around that.
I think just a sentence to try and give a bit of clarity behind it.
And of course, the next job is you're required to do a summary and what information goes in that summary to every rate, supposed every rate payer, and they'll read it. Would be useful as well. I think that's something that probably should go to council.
Yeah.
Those key points,
Well,
Are you
those are the
about the
things
summary
people are
annual
going to,
annual summary, annual report.
yeah.
Does people know what I mean by summary annual report? Grace doesn't
Is it
know.
like a cover note?
No,
It's pretty much a condensed version
Right, yeah.
of the annual report. It's much more readable. So there are certain things that we have to include in it. But there's under legislation, but there's also bits that we can include that we think would be useful to the reader. So that's required to be made publicly available within 1 month of adoption of the full annual report. So we won't have a council meeting. Actually, we can probably do a draft to bring
Yes.
to the council meeting in October.
yeah,
Um,
that would,
and then we will adopt, or we don't adopt it, but we will publish that final version before the end of November.
Yeah, it's not about putting a spin on it. It's about trying to draw people's attention to not just things that need scrutiny, but also the explanations behind it. Try and help inform people.
It sounds a little bit spinny.
Pardon?
It does sound a little bit spinny.
The summary.
Well, no, just it's sort of like the justification. I think people are going to be grumpy at regardless, but I do think it's helpful for them to know that it wasn't a surprise result.
Well, even more than that, it was preempted and discussed in advance, and the council agreed on a strategy going forward.
yes,
So it wasn't a, oh my gosh, it's happened. How do we now massage it into life?
Yeah.
It was more around, we know it's going to happen. Are the reasons justifiable? And are we comfortable with accepting that in advance? So that's what
Yeah.
was done.
Yeah.
And, so it was a calculated result.
I when I was looking at these, I felt uncomfortable because I feel like this council was all elected on the premise of rates are unaffordable, we need to do something about it, and it looks like under our watch it's got worse. And so I'm concerned how that's going to wash out when the town starts paying attention to this. The idea of having this bill plus 2%, I think feels irrelevant if we're not going to be close to it. And so I just wonder how we need to change the expected limit is because it just looks bad. And if it's unrealistic to say we can get to that target, we shouldn't have that target, or we need to be doing some serious cuts, because I just think it looks like we're managing things poorly, and it's the first thing in the governance that we prudently manage finances, and I think it looks like we've blown out in that area. And so I'm just concerned that if the target's wrong, then we need to look at that perhaps.
I think perhaps if you're right, in a way, I mean, if you look back, historically, that limit has worked in the past. What was different this time was the extraordinarily high CPI that skewed everything. You know, nobody predicted 7% CPI, which made it impossible for any council really to get close to that 2% buffer. It just completely blew everything out. But if you look back historically, we're there or thereabouts.
you're pretty close, apart from. way back
What
in
was 19?
19.
Yeah.
Can I add something?
Sure.
So that is a conversation as well that we've started having with the LTP work. So I don't know if you recall earlier in the year, we did talk about these limits. And one of the things we discuss with council is whether you do want to look at changing that limit in the next LTP. So councils do vary in terms of what they see as that rates income affordability. So I know up the road in Masterton, they do the Burl Cost Index plus 4%, and other councils have different limits in there. So that is something that we will look at again before finalising the long-term plan and what you think is appropriate.
But again, it's, again, transparency, it's reported as is, you know. But yeah, I think agree some of that commentary would be useful.
Ladies and gentlemen.
I was going to say, yeah,
Any
yeah.
questions?
You must have some, Steve.
Steve had something on the tip of his tongue.
Just you've marked a couple of things in yellow.
Right.
Are they to be updated, is
Yes.
what you're mentioning? So the figures that are written in there, they're not close to, they're just figures.
Generally, they're figures from last year that we haven't updated. So like on note 14 equity, we've got the table highlighted, which is from last year's. And same with the capital commitments. So it's not an estimate, it is simply last year's.
Okay, I was just looking at on page 52
Mhm.
of the agenda. And just those hours that are highlighted in there.
No, you are correct that those ones are estimates in the SSPs, but those were ones that we wanted to have a little bit of a closer look at still. We were doing some additional work around the data. With
Yeah, it's just-
anything in particular.
Oh, they're just a little, I just think they're a little bit confusing because we've got the urgent call outs that it's taken 7 hours,
Mhm.
whereas we've got the non-urgent call outs that taken 2.15 hours. So it's a little bit
Yes.
skew with.
Yeah. So that's one of the reasons we did want to have a look at those ones a little bit closer, and also the urgent ones. We've got the attendance time and the resolution time, both the same. So we are looking at those again before we finalise them. So take that on board. Thanks.
And I wonder whether too, you know, with the storm event, right? Whether that was the maximum time achieved, because you might have actually had one that took 7 hours because you're busy doing something else as well. So, you know, that you got to, I think you're having a good close look, right? Yes.
There'd be a lot more non-urgent than there would be urgent.
Yes, absolutely.
112 to 7.
But
Scary sort of a sample.
yeah, but the measures you can't change until you do the LTP. So that's a discussion that as part of your LTP that you need to have a look at all these measures before next annual report, because you'll need to adopt your next LTP before you adopt your next annual report. So that's why this annual report is actually quite important, particularly around the measures that even you're uncomfortable about. Now is the time to actually speak up, because staff can go away and bring back some alternative options for you to consider. You might want to actually improve the measures. Both you might want to shorten some or lengthen one, depending on what your view is of what the community expect in terms of that measure.
The performance results for the potable water compliance issues, you know, that was not achieving still. Is that still a follow on because we've got to get 2 years data, or either way? I understand that we can get 2 years data full compliance before we comply.
Yes, so that data is still kind of flagged by the work that was going on at the treatment plant. So now that Frederick Street is up and running and Scala is up and running, the next financial year all that data should be in place.
So we should have the ticks next year.
Yes, what you
So,
say. Yep, it's the plan.
yeah.
I had a positive takeout in Solitaires section. I love that the targets are all 100% and we're like that close to meeting them. I think that's really a good news story.
But again, right, the target is 100%, and it's pretty hard to get there, isn't it?
Yeah.
It just takes one.
One thing, yeah.
One person
Yeah.
to be away or
Yeah.
one thing to slip through. Okay.
But those targets are legislative too, aren't
They
they?
are.
It's a bit like the Bill measure, this council has always tried to keep the highest possible target or the lowest possible variance and tried to get there. Yes, it doesn't look great if it's not achieved, but take into account the measure that we're aiming at is, still prudent and.
Mhm.
Steve?
No, there's a number of Steves. No, there's actually.
I've got sticky notes all over.
The other thing that I always seem to pull out is the water, the potable water and the demand and so forth. And it's good to see that there's been a decrease in water loss from 100 litres last year to 72 litres last year per day. I still get really confused by but with these figures, in that if you work that out, the times 365 days a year, the average usage is 132 cube per resident a year. So I just find it really, when you break down the 220 cubes that we give every resident, we allocate, that's 600 litres per day that they can use. So I just struggle with, it's probably not really part of this, whether we should be going on to a user pays system for our water, just with the less amount that people use really is what I'm looking at. And if I look at, we've got something in here that our performance, so forth, is less than 400 litres, but we provide 600 litres. So
You are right, it's not part of this. But
Yeah.
you're preaching to the converted here.
Again, that's a discussion again, right? So this is what I was referring to before. Look at the measures really closely as part of what's been achieved as part of this annual report and have a good look at them for your LTP, because Steve, that's a perfect discussion to have as part of the LTP. There's one minor issue with the way the legislation is in terms of water at the moment, in terms of LTPs, isn't there? Right? Well, you can't actually plan to do anything for free waters in the LTPs anyway. But again, it's a good discussion to have as part of your LTP.
Although with Three Waters coming on stream, it's likely to be a moot discussion.
Yep.
Well, yeah, it's the fact that we rate
Yeah.
on 220 cubic metres,
Yep.
but the average usage is 32.
Yep.
So,
Any of the other Steves?
I'm desperately trying to find where it is and I can't, but just the number of employees on the face of it, have had a reasonably significant increase. And if there's one number in the report that people will look for, even if they can find it, and I can't now.
So it's in the notes.
Yeah,
It's on page
I just wonder if
65,
if there is an explanation for that.
the agenda.
Looks like on the face of it, a 15 or 16% increase in staffing numbers, but I think it's got something to do with your transition funding, Three Waters and
Yeah,
all
that's
that sort of thing, so.
That's definitely part of it. So we did introduce some new roles around that were fully funded by the transition funding.
Yep.
We did also, council decided to introduce a couple more roles,
IT.
IT.
I recall half an IT person, but that's,
No, that was a full IT person. Yeah, yeah. So it was a combination, I guess, of addressing some of the risks that council's facing and the increased workload that we're undertook. So I guess the good thing is a decent portion is funded either by external funding, grant funding, or by fees and charges, such as in addition to this, the corridor access role, the new role that we're going to be introducing. I might just see if Jerry would like to add. Ed?
Is it easier if I come over?
Yep, please do.
So firstly, too, I'd say just by way of statistics, it's important to remember that this is a snapshot of current employees as at a date. So the previous ones has an alert for staff that are unemployed, so vacancies. So there's quite there can be an increase in that way. But also the important part is it's about the FTE, so full-time equivalent value rather than the headcount value. So we have split some roles into 2 part-time roles, for example. Our Māori liaison roles are 2 part-timers rather than 1 full-timer. So the FTE, the full-time equivalent component remains the same, but the headcount is obviously increased. So by way of the increase there. As Kelly said, we've got some fixed term roles that we've taken on through Waikato Kotahi funding since last year, and then the DIA, so Three Waters, and the Māori liaison roles are externally funded. Does that help the increase?
Yeah, I kind of knew that. Well, I guess my question is around how that's presented in here. I think if you are going to add some explanations, that would be a good place to do it.
Yeah, we were adding, we did pick up, we've missed a little about the external funding of roles.
Yeah.
We can certainly add in the part about FTE versus headcount numbers, if that's useful by way of explanation.
The other thing too is this document is the summary total, but you remember throughout the year, staff bring through either through here or through the CE's report, the intention to change roles or to add staff or and so forth. So we have the opportunity to get informed well in advance of what's going to happen. This is kind of the cold hard.
Yeah, I understand that, but if this, your committee, because I'm only an observer here, is concerned about risk to council and reputational risk, I just suggest that's one area that people get quite hard.
Yeah, FTE count is the same as last year. Talking about, in terms of cost and the equivalent.
Then if you look at that total personnel cost, that's gone up 10%.
Yep.
Roughly. So it'd be good also to mention that. So
That's meeting the market in terms of.
There's two, so I think there's 2 issues there. One is meeting the market, but 2 is it's all employees irrespective of how they're being funded.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you've got external funding to do the Three Waters stuff, for example, that's only for the Three Waters, it's got to be included in both the remuneration. And the other thing you've got to be careful of is that staffing levels are only one element of costs for council. I know we focus on them, but sometimes be careful here because I am a consultant, right? So, you use money on consultants or employees is often a difficult balance as well. And look, just to reinforce what's been said. So the table where you've got the remuneration bands is the number of employees, right? It's not actually, we don't actually have 82 FTEs.
They're not all employed full time.
Right? If you've got one person for 10 hours, you've got to include that person within that table. And you might have 10 people doing 10 hours, right? And that's why that FTE number is quite important.
Well, the other thing too, which is what we discuss all the time, is what drives employee numbers is workload. It's not anything other than that. So, if we can influence the workload either externally or internally, then that's reflected in the number of people we need around the table to manage that workload. And if there's a better way, I haven't seen it.
Unfortunately, I think it's just every organisation now, there seems to be more paperwork, more health and safety, more jobs to be filling out papers and reports. It's everywhere. And as I say, you'd expect it here too.
Yeah. Well, the community also expect, a higher level of service. And of course, unless you've got people sitting on their hands, which is highly unlikely, right? The only way to do that is actually to put more resources at it. So again, just reinforcing what Deputy Dale said, right? It's about us as governors, what we expect of the Chief Executive to deliver, because he's only. Right? Welcome, Councillor Robin,
Apologies for lateness.
all right.
Work's all done, you can go now.
No, no, yeah, I was just going to say, I've got Grace and then Councillor Robin, while you're thinking about it, have you got any specific questions on the annual report? But Grace, let
Nothing.
Grace go first.
Yeah, nothing specific, no.
Just a question for you as the chair. In your experience looking at other councils' books, what kind of proportion would you expect to see with the total budget of council and the amount that goes to staff?
I don't.
You don't
No.
have any?
No, the reason is because I just talked about, right, it's getting the balance right, right? And I'm aware of a couple of councils that have actually got one water engineer, right? Whereas another council might have 10 water staff because they've actually contracted out. So what I look at is actually what are you delivering? What is the level of service that's expected and those costs? So to me, there is no one single measure to say, this is the right number of staff for the rates. It's what are you delivering and how are you delivering it? Now I'm going to throw the chief executive under the bus here. He's not here. You are required every so often to do a section 17A analysis of your activities. That requires the chief executive to actually look at what activities are being delivered and how are they being delivered and what is the most effective way of actually delivering it. That's what I would be, and that should be as part of the LTP. You don't have to do it every 3 years. You've got to, remind me, Kelly. You've got to do it every so often, but referencing that through your LTP is the appropriate time to look at it. What are we delivering? What does the community want in terms of the level of service and how much is it costing? And what's the most appropriate way to deliver it? Do we use staff? Do we use shared resources? Do we use contractors? And that's the appropriate place to have it. Absolutely, yeah.
So I suppose even just comparing us to the two neighbours, neighbouring councils, you know, we do things quite differently. So both councils contract out their 3 waters, Wellington Water and I can't remember who they use up the road. Here. Whereas we've got our internal team, so we'll have the higher personnel costs, but you would expect them to have the higher contract costs, and same Masterton contract out their parks and reserves work as well. So their, you know, head count may be proportionately lower if you look at total expense, you know, and the proportion personnel costs make up, but you would expect their contract costs to be a lot higher. So.
And when you look at the customer feedback, probably where we get some of the most accolades is through Parks and Reserves and our team. So that it's not just cost, it's cost benefit and meeting those customer expectations.
Absolutely, yeah.
Reflect on the survey.
Yeah, I mean, really good question, Grace, right? And that to me is, you know, it's how do you actually, as governors, decide, yes, we've actually got the right level of expenditure for what the community want, and do we have the right appropriate mechanisms in place? And that's up to the chief executive to deliver. But you as governors sort of can challenge that.
Yeah. Oh, it's just, I'm thinking about it in terms of running a business. I have a business. I know there's lots of business owners around the table, and I know that staff cost is always going to be the lion's share of expense. And so it's just something that I always hone in on these reports, because I'm aware it's our biggest asset and our biggest liability all wrapped into one. And looking at the numbers on page 52, and spreadsheets aren't my favourite thing, so it takes me a while to work through these things, but it looks like from total operating funds, payments to staff and suppliers, we thought we were going to spend 14.5 million and we spent 17, so that's 18% if my maths was correct, and overspend in staff. And I know if I spent 18% more than I was intending to on staff costs, my business would bust within a year. I have a small operating budget, obviously, but I just think 18% overspend is huge. And that was the biggest highlight that I had going through this, that I know that we approved staff for more of the grounds team because they hadn't had like new staff in more than a decade or something, but it just feels like that's significant overspend. And yeah, I hope in our long-term plan, we look at this closely.
I'm looking on
Yeah.
Is it page 52 of the
Of the,
agenda?
sorry, of the agenda, 59 on the digital copy, but 52 is what is printed on the actual sheet, the blue writing.
So page 59 of the agenda.
Next statement. Whole of council funding impact statement.
So if I look at just the personnel costs on page 50. We've spent
Of the-
6.2 million compared to planned 6 million. So there is an overspend, but it's not as it's less than.
It's actually 3.719% to be precise.
Pardon?
It's 3.7. That's the salary costs on the bottom of page 57 of the.
So what does the payments to staff and suppliers include?
That's all your contractors.
Right,
So for example.
that's concerning in itself.
No,
though.
no, can I just finish, right?
Yep.
So for example, if you've had additional funding from the DIA for the Three Waters and you've employed employed a contractor to do that,
Yeah.
that would actually go in to the contractor payments. If
Right.
you've repaired your roads and you've got extra subsidy for that, that goes in there as well.
So it's offset by income.
It's
Right.
offset by income. So you can't, the problem, I don't like the fizz.
Yeah,
Well, there's some components I do like about the funding impact statement, there's others. By actually having staff and suppliers, it's actually too granular.
Mm.
But if you actually go back to what Kelly referred to on page 57 of the agenda or page 50 of the annual report, you can actually see the personnel costs there quite clearly.
yeah, it was something that looking through each time I get to these graphs and I could see the payments to staff and suppliers. My first question I had every time was, how many staff is this covering and what else is it covering? Because I think it seems too indescriptive. And it's the same with when there's examples of, misc items. I'm like, okay, well, what's the misc item? And it just, I feel like for anyone who reads through this and wants to understand it, there's lots of areas where you go, well, what's been hidden underneath that title? And I just find that kind of hard.
Okay, can I defend staff? It's not hidden,
Okay.
right? The issue is the funding impact statements. You are required by regulation to only put the headings that are in the funding impact statement.
Right.
You are not allowed to add any more, or you're not allowed to aggregate it. So if you might actually have a row of zeros, you've still got to put a lot of zeros.
Yeah.
And if you need to aggregate figures, you need to aggregate figures, right? That's why I do not like, one of the issues I have the problem with the funding impact statement. Right? I want to see a bit more detail.
Yeah.
But legally you can't do it. In fact, I would actually, like the increase and decrease in debt is just one movement. I would actually say, from my personal understanding of debt, I'd want to see new debt and refinancing debt as two separate figures, but you're not allowed to in terms of the funding impact statement.
Right.
But
Yeah.
what we could do is look at adding more to our variance explanations at the bottom of the report to
Yep.
explain put some words around at
Yes.
least where we do have variances. So it's not that we can't do nothing, we can't do
Yeah.
anything with the fizz, but we could look at doing something else.
Yeah, no, that's good to know because it's, I just find it was hard to
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
follow and having some words to beef it out would be.
And I think just following on from Kelly has suggested is really good. If you add it to the activity fizz, not the overall fizz, you actually say there's payments to staff and suppliers on budget, nothing. But if they were significantly higher, then why was that incurred?
Mhm.
Right, would be actually really useful. Because I think the staff was actually at 3% or 4%. Let's be kind, round it up a bit.
Well, the other thing too is a constant challenge, and I know we all know that, but it needs to be said as well that when the budgets are prepared, there's a lot of assumptions in that. The assumptions are that the current staff continue at a market rate and so on and so on. But then throughout the year, staff leave or change, and then we go to the market, and the market is the market. The hope is that you replace like with like for the same package.
Mhm.
But that doesn't happen in real life because of the tightness of the market. So the budget that was preset 12 months ago is blown out not through incompetence or failure, but simply adjusting mid-year to meet the market and in order to get through the amount of work. So some years we get away with it and some years we don't. And that's,
Can I also just reinforce what you're saying there is to what was the minimum wage increase?
For the living wage.
10%. 10%, right? So, you know, that's the problem you've got is here is the market moving by 10%.
I agree.
And the problem is he got, because he's being paid that, he's moved 10 and I've only moved 5. Is that fair? And that's the problem. You would see that in your business as well.
Roll-on effect.
It's a roll-on effect,
Absolutely,
yeah. Oh,
Yep.
Councillor Robin.
Hey, just adding on to what Dale said around the budgeting, you know, as you've said, Grace, a lot of us around the table own our own businesses and we set budgets, but we are able to be a lot more agile and reconfigure our budgets throughout a financial year, depending on what is going on and with the economic climate, whereas councils can't. So that's something to really bear in mind. The other thing too, and I don't know, we've had this conversation ever since I've been on council, is that the set of accounts for council, and in particular the FIS, is very, very different to corporate accounts. And I think Kelly having a little bit more explanation will definitely help alleviate, because this question comes up every time and people forget what the answer is. And then next time we have a meeting around this, the same question comes up. So that might be really, really useful, I think, for councillors and for our ratepayers as well.
Yep. Okay. All right. One more. You go for it, Grace.
No, just in response, I agree that as a business owner, we can be more agile than a council. But I mean, personally, my budget for my business has to add up at the end of the day, and the mortgage rate's gone up double what it was when I signed up. But I can't just keep spending more. I have to tighten things up, and so my go-to position is, okay, if we can't afford it because other costs are blown out, we've got to shrink somewhere as well to make it work, because otherwise businesses go under. And I just think we've got to tighten our belt if times are tough. And
Totally understand that, Grace, but council is also committed to, as part of setting our annual plans, is a level of service, which is what I think, I can't remember if it was Dale or Phil had said. And that's where it is a little bit different, because we are committed to those levels of service and legislation as well, which, you know, businesses aren't.
It's a toughie.
And if I can just clarify, the 10% of the living wage was not passed on to all staff comparatively.
I was using that as an example of where you've got those other external factors. Yes, you can, you know, make a decision in your business, but there's all sorts of things that, as Councillor Robin says, we're a slow moving beast, right? And imagine if we said, okay, look, the library's costing us another 10% to run because of 15%. Imagine what would happen if you reduce the library hours by 15%. All right, that's my case. Right? And it's absolutely your call, but you know that's the problem.
which is the discussion we're going to be having in the lead up to the LTP consultation process next year, because levels of service is absolutely what drives expenses for council. And it's trying to find that happy place, which we're going to be challenged with in the next 6 months.
I don't think you're going to find a happy space. I think you're going to find a place that everyone is equally uncomfortable, and that's probably the appropriate place.
Crystal ball goes.
Yeah, crystal ball. Right. Any other questions?
Just a couple of odd things, like odd measures that I noticed. 27 about the safe roads.
Yeah.
The performance measure is the change from the previous year in number of fatal and serious injury crashes. That just seems odd, only comparing it to the previous year. If you had a shocking year one year, it's going to be pretty easy to meet the target, and vice versa. I just wonder if that measure needs to be looked.
Kind of a weird measure. That one is prescribed by DAA, so that.
Okay, there you go. Thanks, Kelly.
Actually, what you can do is you can put another measure in, but you cannot get rid of that measure.
Okay,
So, yeah,
We could add some additional disclosure alongside the result
Yeah.
to
okay.
put out trends over time.
yeah, what I'm saying is part of the LTP, you could actually say, this is another measure. We're going to measure this a rolling average over the last period.
Yeah.
As well as.
As well as.
Probably a better
Yeah. So
representation.
that's, you got two ways of doing it.
Okay, cool. Just a note that I noticed that resident satisfaction with the cycleways was only 35%. I haven't noticed that before, so just mentioning that. And a question about streetlight faults. Does that still apply even when it's not up to us? You know, we've had all those issues with the streetlights that we can't fix. Does that satisfaction measure, is that still affected by that?
That's like the roading satisfaction. So person's satisfaction they don't distinguish how they feel about State Highway 2 and Belvedere Road. So if they're similar, they feel unsatisfied with streetlights, whether it's a network fault or a bulb. They don't.
Okay,
distinguish.
so when it says the measure is streetlight faults repaired within 2 weeks, that applies to both faults we can fix and ones that are out of our control.
So it could, so again, we've only changed we're only recording it as our reservice request when it's a bulk.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure that that's been like that all the time. So previously it could have been that a service request was recorded for a network fault.
Okay,
That's a good point, because we're measured by people's perception of the whole network, whereas 2/3 is outside of our control. But what we are reporting to is our part of it.
and our part of it we're still not meeting. We're only hitting at 52%.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
yep.
Contractors.
Mm.
This is not a question, it's just a comment, and it was what struck me when I first went through the report. I think the outcome is pretty bloody good. I mean, the residual, if you like, the surplus or deficit, we were budgeting for 0.26 million, we've achieved 2.2, and that's always, you know, that's the difference between the income and the expenditure. So expenditure's up a bit, income's up more or less the same amount. And considering the inflationary environment we've been living through, not predicted, and the weather events we've had, not predicted, it's got to be considered a good outcome.
Yep.
That's the overarching impression I have.
Oh, and as we've talked about, there's room for improvement, and that's really, really good, you know, and I think the LTP is there to consider those
And we've currently got audit, you know,
going through.
on the trail, working through everything. So I guess, you know, we'll see their responses. But as Philip said right at the start, as he gets to see, I mean, this is his job, and he believes that we're tracking along satisfactorily for a council like us at this moment in time.
Yeah. I wouldn't say you're perfect, and no, far from it.
You said we were before.
Oh, yeah, well, that's because it was my bonus, wasn't it? Right, yeah. Grace.
One question, this was a formatting one, and I don't know if you set the format or anything. Having on this page here, 52, annual plan column, annual report column, annual report column, annual plan column. Do you set that, or they set it? Okay.
Yeah, okay,
I was like, hang on, we're not comparing apples.
I know,
I'm stupid.
Yep, Colin, that's why I got no.
I spend all my time trying to figure out the numbers, and I'm like, well, they've
Yeah.
screwed up the columns.
Don't get me started, right? Please.
And the other question that I thought, with depreciation, because I know that's one of our big costs, I was interested to see that there's a depreciation figure for governance. What is that? Is it like a?
Don't ask.
Yeah.
For the older members.
That's for all the old age pensioners.
I just thought, what does that count towards? I can't actually think off the top of my head.
It's three, is it redundant, you reckon? Because I just, okay, $3,000 for governance depreciation. What's that mean?
The bouquet of flowers when you don't get elected.
There'll be some, I would imagine there'll be some assets associated.
Small.
Yeah. that'd be smarter, yes.
IT.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's okay.
I just thought it was
Okay.
quite comical.
Yeah, that's. Yeah, this pops up. All right, okay. Any further questions? So if we go to the recommendation on page 7, obviously we're going to receive the report. The question I have is, are we comfortable as a committee that we endorse? So I would actually say we're actually recommending to council that they adopt, well, receive, is it endorse or receive? What are we, I'm just thinking about, I mean, to me, there's a number of things we've raised, right, Robin? I don't want to make it the resolution too complicated, but I think the issue is, I'm happy we endorse it as 2, and then in 3, we actually note the changes that are still required in terms of impairment and other
In the highlighted areas.
I would
that
say
are-
other disclosure issues that have been considered by the committee. Is that, you comfortable with that? I think that, to me, because then we're actually saying there are some issues that we have flagged as this committee without actually trying to list them all. You comfortable with that, committee?
Yep.
Deputy.
Yeah.
So do I have a mover for that? Do I have a seconder? Grace? Any further discussion? All those in favour, please say aye.
Right.
As against, carried. Thank you.
Good effort, team.
Yeah.
Can I also just acknowledge Kelly and Kyra and the team, which is Kelly and Kyra. But also the ELT and everybody who's contributed to this document. It's a powerful piece of work alongside a lot of other powerful pieces of work. And I know we talk about the cost and things like that, but you know, for an organisation of this size to collate that amount of information and bring it forward in a timely fashion so that we can peruse it and also audit, we've got something meaningful to work with, is outstanding once again. So thank you.
Yeah, just endorse that. Yeah. I've only seen one other of these so far.
You've seen the best, now you can look at the rest.
Yeah, all right.
We've set the benchmarks.
So if there's no further discussion. Deputy Mayor Dale, do you want to just leave?
Well, I haven't got one. I haven't
Oh,
thought about that. Hang on.
oh,
Steve's prepared.
Steve's prepared?
My lovely assistant.
Oh, sorry, just throw you under the bus. Thanks, Dave.
Kia tau tō rangamārie, ke runa e ngā iwi o te ao. Let your peace reign on all the people of the world.
Perfect.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you again, everyone, for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Robin.
Thank you. Bye, Robin.
See you
Thanks,
later.
Robin. We've got a water race committee workshop at 1 p.m.